In today's episode, we're looking at the most horrifying polar bear attacks ever recorded. From a kayaker's final night on Greenland's desolate coast to a maintenance worker swallowed by Arctic darkness on a Russian archipelago. But first, we begin on Svalbard, where one researcher's brief step outside became the last decision he ever made. It was July 14th, 2015, and dense summer fog had rolled in from the Barents Sea overnight, reducing visibility across Svalbard's coastal plain to less than 100 feet. The terrain beyond the research outpost dissolved into a featureless wall of gray, where rocky ground, ice, and sky merged into a single colorless expanse. The weather monitoring outpost sat on an exposed ridge approximately 40 miles from the nearest settlement, housing two rotating technicians responsible for maintaining atmospheric sensors distributed across the surrounding terrain. Supply runs arrived by helicopter every 2 weeks. Between deliveries, the outpost operated in near total isolation. Halvard Kjølseth was a 34-year-old glaciology technician from Tromsø who had spent 4 seasons rotating through Svalbard's remote stations. Norwegian law required anyone outside settlements to carry a high-powered rifle for polar bear protection. The outpost maintained 2 rifles, flare cartridges, and a tripwire perimeter alarm system designed to detect approaching bears. The tripwire system had been deactivated 6 days earlier after persistent winds triggered repeated false alarms. The station log also recorded a male polar bear sighted roughly a kilometer to the northeast 5 days prior. No further sightings had been logged since, and the perceived threat had diminished with each uneventful day. Halvard's colleague, Sigbjørn Elstad, 31, was asleep following a night shift when Halvard prepared for the morning instrument check. Standard protocol recommended a second person on visual watch during exterior maintenance, but routine sensor checks close to the station were sometimes performed solo. The nearest sensor array sat approximately 40 meters from the main door, a distance Halvard had covered thousands of times. He pulled on his outer shell, grabbed his equipment toolkit, and stepped outside without retrieving a rifle from the weapons locker. He was wearing diagnostic headphones that temporarily reduced ambient sound required for audio feedback during sensor calibration. The fog was impenetrable. Halvard moved along the familiar gravel path toward the sensor mast, his attention fixed on the diagnostic readout in his hands. Polar bears are the largest terrestrial carnivore by average size, with adult males typically weighing between 900 and 1,300 pounds, depending on season. Unlike most bear species, polar bears are one of the few bear species documented to deliberately stalk and kill humans in predatory attacks. Their pale fur reduces contrast against snow and ice, and fog further limits detection distance. Despite their enormous size, they approach prey in near silence and can sprint up to approximately 25 miles per hour over short distances. The typical predatory attack involves a rapid approach from behind or from concealment, followed by a single overpowering strike. Predatory attacks frequently involve bites to the head and neck, leveraging the animal's enormous size and powerful forelimbs to overwhelm prey within seconds. Based on tracks recovered at the scene, investigators determined the bear had circled the outpost from the northeast, approaching downwind through the fog. The tracks showed the bear had followed low terrain features that would have reduced its visibility from the station until reaching the equipment housing. The tracks indicated the animal had paused briefly behind the equipment housing approximately 15 meters from the sensor mast before continuing its approach. The fog and the diagnostic headphones had significantly reduced both visual and auditory warning. The bear closed the remaining distance in seconds. Halvard had no time to react before the animal struck from behind, the impact driving him to the ground beside the sensor mast. The force of the initial contact sent his toolkit scattering across the gravel. The bear's jaws targeted his head and neck, while its forelimbs pinned him down, delivering a sustained, crushing bite. Sigbjørn was jolted awake by a brief shout, followed by heavy impact against metal. He moved to the station's front window, but could see nothing through the fog. Protocol required retrieving a rifle before exiting during a bear encounter, and he spent approximately a minute unlocking the weapons rack, loading and chambering the rifle before opening the door. He found Halvard on the ground, beside the sensor mast. The bear had begun to reposition the body, but appeared to have disengaged when Sigbjørn exited the station. Injuries were concentrated on the head and upper body, consistent with a sustained predatory cranial bite, while the animal's forelimbs pinned the victim. The initial strike appeared to have incapacitated him almost immediately. Halvard showed no signs of life. Sigbjørn radioed the territorial emergency frequency and remained inside the station until a helicopter team arrived approximately 3 hours later, once visibility had improved enough to permit flight. Halvard Kjølseth was confirmed dead at the scene. The investigation cited the deactivated tripwire, the absent firearm, and the diagnostic headphones as compounding factors. Territorial authorities issued an advisory reinforcing that no distance from a structure should be considered safe without a rifle in polar bear territory. While Svalbard's fog had concealed a predator until it was far too late, the perpetual darkness of a Russian Arctic winter would soon prove even more unforgiving for a man who left his weapon behind for just 1 minute. It was November 22nd, 2016, and polar darkness had settled over Novaya Zemlya 3 weeks earlier. The remote Russian archipelago had not seen sunlight since early November. Wind-driven snow swept horizontally across the frozen landscape, reducing visibility to near zero, even under artificial light. A decommissioned military weather station on the archipelago's southern island maintained a skeleton crew of civilian contractors keeping basic meteorological equipment operational. The station's infrastructure had deteriorated significantly since its military abandonment, with perimeter fencing partially collapsed, exterior lighting unreliable, and heating systems requiring constant manual adjustment. Garbage from the station's small mess hall had been deposited in open bins less than 30 meters from the main building for weeks, a violation of waste management protocols that no one had corrected. Rodion Vershkov was a 43-year-old maintenance technician from Arkhangelsk who had rotated through remote Arctic postings for over a decade. His current assignment required him to maintain the station's aging diesel generators, water systems, and heating infrastructure, work that frequently demanded checks at all hours, regardless of conditions. He was the only maintenance contractor on site during the current rotation, supported by 2 meteorological observers working alternating shifts inside the main building. Deep claw marks were discovered on the generator shed's exterior door, consistent with bear activity. The station supervisor had filed a request for wildlife deterrent supplies, but no delivery had been scheduled. Rodion had been warned about the tracks and had acknowledged the danger. The primary generator began showing fluctuating output readings at approximately 9:40 p.m. The generator shed sat roughly 25 meters from the main building's rear exit, connected by a gravel path with a single overhead floodlight that had been inoperative for several days. Rodion pulled on his heavy parka and exited through the rear door, leaving his rifle propped inside the doorframe. The round trip to check the generator's fuel line typically took less than 3 minutes. He stepped into the darkness, and the door swung shut behind him. Many documented predatory attacks involve adult males, often in compromised body condition. Unlike defensive attacks by females with cubs, predatory approaches by these animals are deliberate, committed, and rarely preceded by warning displays. These bears have been documented testing structures, following human scent trails, and stalking victims over considerable distances. A nutritionally stressed male is far more likely to treat a human encounter as a feeding opportunity, and once feeding begins, disengagement becomes less common unless disturbed. In wind and mechanical noise, the approach can go undetected until the final seconds, and the killing bite is typically directed at the head and neck. Investigators reconstructed events from physical evidence. Boot prints indicated Rodion had reached the shed and opened its door. A second set of tracks, attributed to a large adult male, approached from the direction of the waste bins along a path downwind of Rodion's position. The generator's mechanical noise, still cycling at the time of the investigation, would have likely masked the sound of the bear's approach. The attack occurred between the shed and the main building as Rodion made his return. Drag marks indicated the initial strike knocked him to the ground within meters of the shed door. The force of the impact left deep impressions in the frozen ground where his body had been driven down. Blood evidence and tissue indicated a predatory cranial bite. The drag trail extended approximately 70 meters from the point of contact, leading northeast away from the station toward open tundra. The trail showed continuous drag marks without interruption, indicating the bear had maintained its grip throughout. A meteorological observer noticed the generator output had not stabilized and attempted to radio Rodion at approximately 10:15 p.m. Receiving no response, he moved to the rear door and discovered it ajar, Rodion's rifle still leaning against the frame. Using the station's emergency spotlight, he identified the drag trail in the snow leading away from the building. He sealed the station and radioed for emergency assistance. A military team reached the station by helicopter the following morning once weather permitted safe flight. Rodion Vershkov's partial remains were recovered approximately 200 meters from the station, partially sheltered behind a snow berm consistent with predatory feeding behavior. Feeding appeared limited, possibly due to weather conditions or human activity near the station. The bear was located during coordinated ground tracking operations and destroyed 2 days later. The investigation cited deteriorated perimeter infrastructure, accumulated food waste, inoperative lighting, and the absent firearm as critical factors. While the Russian Arctic's darkness had hidden a predator until the moment of contact, the tundra outside a small Canadian town would soon demonstrate that even the most well-known bear habitat could not protect a man who chose to ignore every warning in front of him. It was October 17, 2014, and the subarctic town of Churchill, Manitoba, sat at the edge of its most dangerous season. Every autumn, polar bears gathered along Hudson Bay's western shore in large numbers, waiting for the sea ice to form so they could return to hunting seals on the pack ice. The concentration of bears near human settlement had earned Churchill the designation of polar bear capital of the world and generated a substantial tourism industry built around vehicle-based bear viewing. Warning signs marked every perimeter access point, advising that polar bears were active beyond town limits and that proceeding on foot was extremely dangerous. A dedicated polar bear alert team patrolled the town boundaries daily, using helicopters, trucks, and cracker shells to keep bears away from populated areas. A holding facility on the outskirts housed bears that ventured too close, relocating them by helicopter once the ice formed. Despite these precautions, the landscape beyond the town perimeter remained among the most dangerous stretches of ground in North America during October and November. Darvel Kempe was a 41-year-old freelance wildlife photographer from Bristol, England, whose portfolio emphasized close-range animal portraits. Kempe had traveled to Churchill independently without booking a guided tundra buggy excursion, arriving with professional camera equipment and an intention to capture images on foot that would distinguish his work from vehicle-based photography. As a visiting foreign national, Kempe had not arranged legal firearm documentation or secured any deterrent equipment. While not formally prohibited, authorities strongly advised against traveling beyond the municipal boundary on foot during peak season without a licensed guide, a precaution Kempe had disregarded. He had not rented a flare gun or bear deterrent from any of the local outfitters that offered them during bear season. Records from his accommodation indicated he had departed on foot in the late afternoon, carrying only camera equipment. Kempe was observed by a local resident passing the final bear warning sign at the northern edge of town at approximately 4:30 p.m. The resident would later tell investigators that the photographer had appeared focused on the tundra ahead, walking with purpose directly beyond the marked boundary. Sunset that evening arrived shortly after 6 p.m. and twilight faded rapidly, reducing contrast across the tundra and making distant movement difficult to detect. Months without access to their primary seal prey. Subadult males, typically between 3 and 5 years old, are particularly dangerous during this period. Lacking the size and experience to compete with dominant adults for prime hunting positions once the ice forms, subadults are more likely to investigate unusual stimuli, including humans, as potential food sources. Their predatory behavior is opportunistic, often triggered by a prey item that appears vulnerable, isolated, or unaware. Subadults remain more than capable of delivering a fatal cranial bite. When Kempe failed to return to his accommodation that evening, the owner contacted local authorities. The alert team discovered his body at approximately 7:30 the following morning during a directed search, roughly 300 meters beyond the last warning sign. His camera and tripod were found deployed approximately 10 meters from the point of initial contact, suggesting he had been stationary or moving slowly when approached from behind. Investigators determined the attack had been sudden and overwhelming. Injuries to the head and neck were consistent with a predatory predatory cranial bite. Evidence at the scene indicated repeated forelimb strikes to the upper body after the initial bite. Drag marks extended approximately 40 meters toward a shallow depression in the tundra where the body was found. The bear had partially fed before abandoning the remains, a pattern consistent with the disturbance, possibly the distant sound of the alert team's vehicle during early morning operations. Tracks indicated a single large sub-adult male. The bear believed responsible was located and destroyed the following day under Provincial Wildlife Authority authorization after being deemed a high-risk predatory animal. The investigation concluded that Kempe had voluntarily passed clearly marked warning signage, entered active polar bear habitat without deterrence or protective equipment, and remained on the tundra past the point where fading light eliminated any possibility of detecting an approaching bear. The coroner ruled the death as misadventure, while Churchill's tundra had claimed a photographer who walked past every warning available. The industrial corridors of Alaska's remote North Slope would soon prove that even a fenced work camp could not protect a man from a predator that had already learned to associate humans with food. It was September 26th, 2017, and the first hard freeze of autumn had locked Alaska's North Slope into frozen mud and ice-crusted gravel. The vast coastal plains stretching south from the Beaufort Sea supported a network of oil extraction operations connected by elevated pipelines and gravel roads. A small subcontractor support camp sat along a service road approximately 18 miles from the nearest major facility. The camp consisted of a cluster of modular sleeping units, a mess trailer, a maintenance bay, and several rows of shipping containers housing tools and replacement parts. Unlike the larger company-operated facilities, which maintained dedicated wildlife monitors, electric perimeter fencing, and strict food waste protocols, the subcontractor camp operated under reduced oversight. A chain-link perimeter fence, partially damaged by vehicle traffic and weather, enclosed the main living and working areas, but left gaps near the container storage rows on the camp's southern edge. Brogan Tarlick was a 38-year-old contract heavy equipment mechanic from Fairbanks who had worked North Slope rotations for 7 years. Tarlick was familiar with polar bear safety protocols, though the subcontractor's enforcement had been inconsistent. Camp records showed that food waste from the mess trailer had been deposited in unsecured dumpsters near the container rows on at least 5 occasions during the previous 2 weeks, in violation of regional wildlife regulations. A security camera mounted on the mess trailer had captured footage on 3 separate nights of a large polar bear investigating the dumpsters, pulling at lids and circling the container rows before retreating toward the coast. The camp supervisor had reported the sightings to the primary contractor, but had not restricted access to the container area or secured the waste receptacles at the time of the incident. Tarlick began his shift before sunrise, walking from his sleeping unit toward the maintenance bay, along a route that passed between 2 rows of shipping containers. The narrow corridor between the container rows was unlit, with visibility limited to the ambient glow from the mess trailer's exterior light, approximately 60 meters away. The containers created blind corners at each intersection, with no sight line extending more than 20 feet in any direction. Polar bears that become food conditioned through repeated access to human waste undergo a behavioral shift that makes them exceptionally dangerous. Unlike bears that encounter humans unexpectedly, food-conditioned bears associate human infrastructure and human scent with caloric reward. Over repeated exposures, wariness of humans diminishes until close-range encounters become inevitable. A food-conditioned adult male encountering a human at close range in a confined space is more likely to approach closely and respond with predatory behavior rather than retreat. Tracks in frost and wind-packed snow indicated the bear had entered the camp through the damaged southern fence section and had been moving between the containers for some time before the encounter. The tracks showed a pattern of movement consistent with an animal familiar with the camp's layout, circling the dumpster area before moving deeper between the container rows. A co-worker in the maintenance bay heard a single shout at approximately 5:50 a.m., followed by the sound of something heavy striking a metal container. He grabbed a spotlight and moved toward the container rows, where he found Tarlick on the ground between containers. The bear was still present, approximately 30 feet away at the end of the row, its massive frame blocking the narrow corridor. The coworker retreated immediately and radioed for emergency assistance, firing one of the camp's flare guns from the maintenance bay doorway. The bear moved off through the fence gap and disappeared toward the coast. Emergency responders from the nearest facility arrived within 40 minutes. Brogan Tarlik was confirmed dead at the scene. Injuries were concentrated on the head, neck, and upper body, consistent with a predatory attack. The investigation cited the unsecured food waste, the damaged perimeter fence, repeated documented bear activity that had not been acted upon, and the absence of lighting in the container corridor as contributing factors. The subcontractor was fined, and the camp was shut down for an extended safety review. The bear was located during coordinated aerial search operations and destroyed 4 days later under Federal Wildlife Authority authorization, and a necropsy confirmed the animal was an adult male in fair to poor body condition. While Alaska's industrial infrastructure had failed to protect one of its own, the most remote coastline in the northern hemisphere was about to deliver the quietest and most devastating attack of all, one that would not be discovered for days. It was August 11th, 2013, and Greenland's east coast stretched in an unbroken line of fjords, glaciers, and gravel beaches for over 1,000 miles, virtually uninhabited, except for a handful of Inuit settlements separated by days of travel. Seasonal sea ice distribution had shifted the region's polar bear population along coastal corridors, where they roamed beaches and headlands in search of food. The retreat of pack ice from the coastline left bears moving along exposed shorelines, investigating anything that carried the scent of potential calories. Pelle Moritzen was a 46-year-old outdoor expedition guide from Aalborg, Denmark, whose career centered on solo unsupported journeys through remote landscapes. He had completed expeditions across Patagonia, Iceland, and northern Scandinavia. His current undertaking was a solo kayaking traverse of Scoresby Sound, the largest fjord system on Earth, covering over 300 miles with no support, no resupply, and no scheduled contact. Moritzen had departed from the settlement of Itokortormit in early August, carrying supplies for approximately 3 weeks. His equipment included a sea kayak, camping gear, food stores, a VHF radio, and a bolt-action rifle chambered for polar bear defense. He had filed a route plan with local authorities and carried a personal locator beacon for emergency activation. The investigation that followed relied entirely on scene reconstruction. What investigators pieced together came from physical evidence at the campsite, the condition of the remains, and Moritzen's own equipment and logbook. His logbook, recovered from a dry bag inside the tent vestibule, indicated he had made camp on an exposed gravel beach at the mouth of a narrow fjord. The final entry, dated 2 days before the campsite's discovery, noted calm conditions, scattered ice in the fjord, and a bear sighting on a distant headland earlier that afternoon. The entry recorded no immediate concern. Investigators determined that Moritzen had pitched his tent on open ground approximately 20 meters from the waterline, with his kayak pulled above the tide line nearby. The rifle was found inside the tent, along the interior wall near the sleeping bag. No tripwire perimeter alarm had been deployed, though commercially available systems were recommended equipment for solo Arctic camping. Most critically, his food supplies, including sealed bags of dried meals and energy bars, were stored inside the tent vestibule rather than cached at a distance from the sleeping area, a practice that concentrated food sent directly at the campsite. During seasonal shifts in sea ice distribution, bears traveling coastal corridors investigate any scent suggesting caloric opportunity, including human food stores, cooking residue, and the humans themselves. A bear investigating a tent typically approaches silently, circling the structure before collapsing or tearing the tent before delivering a bite. Onshore winds can carry food sent significant distances along open coastal corridors. Documented Arctic expedition attacks have occurred during night investigations of tents, as the victim is confined, disoriented, and unable to defend effectively. Evidence Evidence at the campsite told investigators the sequence with grim clarity. Bear tracks approached the tent from the north, following the beach from the direction of the headland where Moritzen had noted the earlier sighting. The wind direction that night would have carried scent along the beach corridor toward the approaching bear. The tent had been collapsed from above, the fabric shredded by claws and punctured by teeth in a pattern consistent with a bear pressing down onto the structure with its full weight. The interior showed signs of violent disruption, with the sleeping bag torn and equipment scattered. The rifle was found unfired, magazine loaded, chamber empty. Investigators concluded that the sudden collapse likely prevented Moritzen from accessing or operating the weapon in time. Remains were found approximately 90 meters from the campsite, along a drag trail that led up the gravel beach toward a rocky outcrop. Evidence of partial consumption was consistent with documented predatory feeding behavior. The tent, while destroyed, still contained Moritzen's logbook, radio, and personal locator beacon, none of which had been activated. A group of Inuit hunters from Itokorturmit discovered the campsite 3 days later while traveling along the coast by boat. They identified the damaged tent and the kayak still resting above the tide line and alerted authorities via satellite phone. Danish police and wildlife officials reached the site the following day. Pelle Moritzen's identity was confirmed through personal effects and dental records. The investigation concluded that a polar bear, possibly the same animal observed by Moritzen on the headland, had been drawn to the campsite by food scent and attacked the tent during the night. The absent perimeter alarm, the storage of food within the tent, and the rifle's inaccessible position at the moment of attack were cited as critical factors. The bear was never identified or located. Danish authorities reinforced strong recommendations for the use of tripwire alarm systems and proper food caching distances for all expeditions in eastern Greenland. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.